Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're plunging into the shadowy, turbulent world of the medieval papacy, where divine authority took detours through nepotism, bribery, and scandals so wild they'd make any soap opera blush. Before we slip behind these ancient walls, do me a favor. If you enjoy unearthing history's darkest secrets, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our midnight explorers and dawn detectives logging in from every time zone. Okay, lights down. Maybe flip on a fan for that soft whisper of background noise and settle in. I want you to imagine you're stepping into a cold, torchlit corridor of the Lateran Palace in the year 955. The air smells of incense, wet stone, and something faintly metallic, like destiny being forged. Every echo of your footsteps seems to carry 1,000 prayers and 1,000 schemes. You're not here for blessings or sermons. You're here because something whispered to you that the center of Western Christendom is not always a place of prayer. It can be a den of human ambition and outrage. I know what you're picturing when I say papacy, a serene figure in white robes waving from a balcony, blessing the crowds with gentle words about peace and piety. But that image is a Hollywood gloss over what really went down. The truth? Sometimes the man at the top was a bored teenage noble who treated the church treasury as his own casino fund. Sometimes he built moats around his palace out of pure paranoia. And once, or twice, a pope tossed his predecessor's corpse into a courtroom and put it on trial. Yes, you heard me right. Our first stop is the story of Pope John the Puritcan, Octavianus by birth, a boy of 18, crowned Pope John in 955. Take a moment to picture him, barely out of adolescence, sandals still untied, robes far too large, stepping onto the threshold of the Vicar of Christ. His family's influence in Rome was so vast they could have stamped for Vatican use only on every document. In a society where lineage mattered more than learning, Octavianus was the ideal candidate, no questions asked. He didn't need deep theological training. He needed allies, and his clan provided them. But once he donned the papal garments, he didn't pray. He played. Chroniclers whispered about dice games in the audience chamber. Dice games where the losers paid penance in gold from the church coffers. Witnesses accused him of invoking pagan gods when the dice were against him. Imagine sitting before your spiritual leader, clutching your tithe receipt, and watching him curse Jupiter if he lost. Meanwhile, those same nobles who gifted him the chair were lining up for favors and offices. The whole court became a swirling dance of bribes, wagers, and wild banquets. I still get chills thinking about the stories from those feasts. They weren't quiet affairs. They were raucous, torchlit parties where music clashed with laughter and wine flowed like rivers into goblets carved from silver. Some accounts say the Lateran palace turned into a pleasure palace so notorious that Roman taverns couldn't hold a candle to it. They talk about mistresses, some married, some cloistered nuns, and one poor bread deliverer who swore she only thought she was delivering loaves. She ended up with regrets instead of bread, and a story that ended in tears and a whispered promise to burn her rosary. John the Puritcan's reign feels almost like someone dared him. You have all this power. What's the worst you can do? And he answered by holding mock tribunals against political enemies. Eyes were gouged, tongues cut out, and rumors flew that he even raised and lost armies on a whim, pleading for Emperor Otto I's help one day and plotting against him the next. The ultimate climax? In 964, legends say he died of a stroke in bed with a married woman. Sinners whispered divine retribution. Cynics suspected the cuckolded spouse had his own designs. I imagine standing over that bed, candles guttering, hearing the final breath of a man who treated holiness like a stage prop. To me, that moment crystallizes everything about power. The office of St. Peter's successor was meant to be the highest spiritual calling. Instead, John the XII turned it into something resembling a decadent carnival. He overperformed every scandalous expectation. But there's more you need to see with your mind's eye. Picture wandering into the private chambers just off the main cathedral, rooms lined with tapestries depicting saints and martyrs, but also heavy velvet banners custom embroidered with John's family crest. In one corner lay a chest rumored to contain papal bulls and dice. Those ivory cubes were said to have been whittled from altar railings and used to settle everything from who got the next bishopric to who would host the Pope's next midnight revel. It was spiritual roulette. At dusk, John would summon his close companions, cardinals, cousins, and distant relations, all too happy to fill their pockets. By the flicker of torches, they'd debate theology and politics in equal measure, exchanging whispered promises of land grants for loyalty. Outside, the narrow streets of Rome throbbed with tension. The common folk whispered that their Holy Father was as mercurial as Jupiter himself, bestowed blessings one moment, then plotting vengeance the next. Merchants dared not speak ill, yet rumor spread like wildfire. The Pope's palace is wilder than Bacchus's feast. Imagine the hush that fell over those narrow alleys whenever someone heard hoofbeats. John's personal cavalry, perhaps, riding to quell an uprising or deliver secret orders. It was said he once had his own stable transformed into an impromptu chapel, stables, pews, and all, simply to prove that sanctity could sprout anywhere, even among hay and horses. And if that wasn't enough, chroniclers accused him of blessing men with his left hand, an act so taboo it was likened to flipping the spiritual bird. I still remember the first time I read about the brothel rumors. There's something haunting about imagining sacred hallways echoing with the laughter of courtesans, the rustle of silk against marble floors, priests stumbling through curtained rooms in search of more carnal masses. Some contemporaries even claimed the palace corridors were lined with silk drapes to muffle sounds, quiet enough to let sin blossom in secrecy. It makes me wonder, how different would we view sanctity if holiness and hedonism often shared the same bed? By the end, John's excesses provoked outrage not just in Rome, but across Christendom. Metropolitan bishops hissed behind closed doors. German princes fumed at Otto's humiliation, and even the emperor grew tired of the boy pope's betrayals. In 963, Otto's armies marched on Rome, deposed John, and installed a sober successor. But John the XII, ever the drama king, slipped back like a shadow, bribing guards, threatening cardinals, and reclaiming his throne in a blur of chaos. It's hard to overstate how radical this was. A teenage pope, exiled, reinstated, and exiled again, all within a few short years. To me, it's the ultimate testament to the era's volatility, when spiritual offices were mere tokens in a grand game of power. And though John the XII's flame burned out in scandal, the embers of his misdeeds lingered, a warning that faith, when entangled with ambition, can become a dangerously combustible mix. So lean back, breathe deep, and let the ghosts of those torchlit banquets echo in your mind. Remember the weight of the mitre on an 18-year-old's head, the rattle of dice beneath velvet cloaks, and the hush of sacred halls turned playgrounds for the powerful. When power and faith collide, the fallout can be both magnificent and terrifying. When John the XIV's tempestuous tenure finally collapsed under its own weight of excess, Rome might have hoped for a moment's peace. Instead, the papal throne passed, once again, to a scion of raw ambition, Theophylactus of the Tusculan clan, who became Pope Benedict IX around 1032. His story first reached me in a tattered margin note of a medieval chronicle, an offhand jibe that Benedict IX held the sea thrice. At first I assumed a scribal error, but as I uncovered more, I realized it was no mistake. A single young man, elected at barely 20, deposed twice, sold his own office, and then reclaimed it a third time. Rome, in the spring of 1032, was a city of narrow cobblestone streets, half-ruined temples, and above it all, the looming spires of the Lateran. Word spread. The new pope was Theophylactus, nephew of the powerful Count Alberic, chosen less for piety than pedigree. Imagine being part of a family so confident in its sway that when someone else held St. Peter's keys, they simply waited until the time was right. No cardinals murmured questions of His Holiness. They whispered only of bribes, alliances, and the Tusculan pocketbook. On his enthronement day, Benedict IX stepped into the basilica, his face smooth as marble, eyes bright with mischief. He wore vestments that shimmered in the candlelight, so new and ornate they seemed borrowed from a distant emperor rather than fashioned by humble clerics. The crowd hushed as he raised his hand to bless them, yet that blessing felt more like a challenge. In those early days, the palace cultured itself with a restless energy. Feasts in the nave, tournaments in the courtyard, and at night, the crack of wooden lances mingling with chanting choirs echoing off ancient walls. But the pageantry was only the opening act. Within months, Benedict's court resembled a lavish carnival. Chroniclers tell of banquets where dozens of silver platters piled high with peacocks and boars were consumed in a single evening. The air crackled with laughter as jesters and minstrels performed bawdy ditties, some praising the Pope's divine vigor, in verses that would make any monk blush. One account even accuses Benedict IX of staging mock naval battles in the palace's grand hall, flooding the floor with water, seating nobles in small boats, and letting toy galleys clash beneath starlit tapestries. Whether literal or allegorical, it captures the scale of his audacity. Perhaps most unsettling were the exotic beasts. Bears collared and led through cloisters, leopards lounging on crimson cushions, and a tame lion cub who hissed at courtiers. These creatures became symbols of Benedict's dominion, untamed forces caged only by his whim. I remember the first time I read that detail, the mental image of a lion's roar resonating in a sanctuary once dedicated to silent prayer sent a chill down my spine. Yet beneath the spectacle lurked violence. In his first year, Benedict IX raised a private militia drawn from his family's retainers. Armed with crossbows and axes, they patrolled Rome's districts, enforcing the Pope's will. Rival baronial factions clashed in the streets. Churches meant for sanctuary were ransacked when suspicion fell on their patrons. A chronicler recorded hearing the terrified wails of nuns fleeing into side chapels, seeking refuge from soldiers who drummed leather shields and shouted Benedict's name. Old men huddled in doorways, crossing themselves when papal banners passed overhead. By 1044, the people's patience snapped. A furious mob, merchants, artisans, even barefoot children, stormed the Lateran palace gates. They tore down tapestries, smashed the ornate gates, and dragged Benedict's effigies through the mud. In the chaos, they installed Sylvester III, a meek cardinal unprepared for power. But Benedict VI, cunning and undeterred, bribed his jailers, slipped out under moonlight, and reclaimed the throne within weeks. Sylvester was driven from the city, his pontificate dismissed as a brief aberration. It was this cycle of power and reprisal that led to the unimaginable in 1045. Benedict VI sold the papacy. The chronicles are gruesomely precise. In a gilded hall hung with ancestral portraits, Benedict transferred the keys of St. Peter's to his godfather, John Gratian, in exchange for fields in Tuscany, copious coin, and the promise of lifelong immunity from prosecution. Gratian assumed the name Gregory VI, swearing oaths of gratitude, while Benedict, having monetized his vocation, slipped away. The ceremony felt less a sacred transition than a property sale, Benedict presenting a deed, Gregory signing the contract, the cardinals nodding, their faces a mix of horror and greed. Yet even this audacious act didn't quell Benedict's thirst for drama. Within months, he realized his windfall failed to buy him the affection he craved. Romantic rumors swirl that his motive was to woo a noblewoman whose heart didn't melt at papal gold. So, in 1046, he returned again, surrounded by armed supporters, storming palaces and deposing Gregory VI. Once more he wore the tiara, crowning himself amid the wreckage of civic order. This third reign, ephemeral and fevered, finally drew the attention of Emperor Henry III. The German monarch, weary of papal carnival and corruption, summoned a synod at Sutri. There, before assembled bishops clad in black and purple, Benedict IX faced his accusers. Charged with sacrilege, simony, and scandal, he was deposed for the third and final time. His fate afterward is murky. Some say he entered a monastery under a false name. Others that he died abandoned in a Roman hospice. His legend, however, endured. To me, Benedict VI's saga represents the nadir of a church consumed by human vice. Throughout my years studying these events, I've often wondered how ordinary Romans endured such upheaval. In the catacombs and crypts, I found heartfelt petitions scratched into stone. "O Peter, protect us from boy kings who turn holy orders into folly." These words, carved by trembling hands, show how the faithful clung to hope, even as the church they loved became a carnival of vice. It's in those silent inscriptions that I see the true power of faith, and the peril when that faith is betrayed. Benedict IX's 3 tumultuous reigns sparked reformers' early calls to disentangle spiritual authority from familial ambition. They set in motion the very movements that, a century later, would ignite the Gregorian reforms and firm the boundary between church and secular meddling. Yet for all the reforms that followed, the echoes of Benedict's carnival lingered. In the vacant halls of the Lateran, I can almost hear phantom laughter and the distant clash of lances. His papacy reminds me that any institution, no matter how sacred, can be warped by unchecked ambition, and that tears and prayers scrawled on cold stone can outlast the mightiest throne. When Benedict IX finally stumbled from the scene, Rome briefly exhaled, hoping the worst was over. Instead, a shadow lingered, a quartet of powerful women whose webs of ambition would snare the papacy itself. Their names, Theodora, her daughter Marozia, and Marozia's daughter, echo in the darkest corners of ecclesiastical infamy. This was the era later dubbed the pornocracy, a rule of mistresses and matriarchs who treated the Vatican as their personal stage. I first sensed their influence when I found a dusty ledger in the Lateran archives, its faded ink chronicling gifts not to popes, but to Theodora, a noble woman whose palace overlooked St. Peter's. In her day, Theodora was whispered about in the market stalls, a woman of grace and, in equal measure, calculated ambition. She claimed descent from Roman senatorial stock and parlayed her lineage into sway over cardinals and curial officials. She didn't lead armies or preach sermons, yet from her gilded balcony she could make or break pontiffs. Her daughter, Marozia, inherited more than her mother's cunning. She inherited her throne. By the early 10th century, Marozia had married successive counts and earls, binding alliances across Italy. With each marriage came fresh power, fresh armies, and a growing grip on Rome's political heart. It was said she kept a list of potential popes in her boudoir, consulting it like a gossip column when the time came to crown or depose a pontiff. The first time I walked through the remains of Marozia's palace, I traced my fingers over cracked frescoes that hinted at banquets, where clergy sat beside courtesans, their idle gossip mingling with the clatter of eating. These halls once held secrets, whispered over goblets of spiced wine, confidences traded like currency, and the promise of cardinalships bartered for loyalty. I could almost hear Marozia's laugh echoing off the stone, sharp and triumphant. Her influence climaxed in 904, when she arranged the election of Pope Sergius III, her paramour. Imagine the scandal, a new pope ascending the steps of the Lateran not on whispers of sanctity, but on the strength of a noble woman's favor. Sergius, scarred, silver-haired, and merciless, owed Marozia everything. He filled the College of Cardinals with her allies, granted her estates, and turned a blind eye when her retainers crushed rival families. What I find most chilling is not the open alliances, but the hidden cruelties. One account tells of a rival noblewoman imprisoned in Marozia's tower, only to vanish one stormy night. No trial, no last confession, just silence. Some say it was Marozia's hand at work. Others whisper of Sergius' enforcers. In those accounts, the line between churchman and henchman blurred until for the people of Rome, piety meant little when bullets and blades spoke so loudly. Yet power seldom rests. Marozia's daughter, sometimes called Marozia II, or by her formal name, the Princess of Rome, grew into her mother's role with an even colder efficiency. Where Marozia charm bargained, her daughter command barked. By the time she reached her majority, the papacy had become an inheritance, swapped among cousins and uncles as though it were family silver. It was her daughter's maneuvering that led, in 965, to the most macabre papal drama of all, the Cadaver Synod. I remember the first time I read that phrase. Echoes of death wielded like a gavel. Pope Stephen VI, aligned with the ruling Margravate, ordered the corpse of Pope Formosus exhumed, dressed in papal robes and propped on a throne inside the basilica. A deacon was appointed to speak in Formosus's defense, while Stephen's judges leveled charges of perjury and illicit election. The corpse, silent as any defendant, was pronounced guilty. Its fingers, the very digits used to bless, were hacked off, and the body flung into the Tiber. If you can picture that scene, rotten flesh draped in silk, candlelight dancing on half-melted wax, you understand how far Rome had fallen. This grotesque trial wasn't mere spectacle. It was raw political theater, a means of erasing a rival's legacy. It made headlines in every market district. Pope found guilty posthumously. They said the stench lingered in the basilica for days, a bitter reminder that ambition could turn even the holiest office into a mortuary. Yet rebellion followed. Within months, Stephen VI was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled by unknown hands. Vengeance, perhaps, for the death of dignity itself. Formosus's corpse was fished from the river, reburied with honor, and the tapestry of papal legitimacy, torn to tatters, began piecing itself back together, albeit raggedly. Through these horrors, I've often asked myself, how did the city bear it? How did the faithful pray, knowing their pope might be a puppet of a palace intrigue? In the crypt beneath San Clemente, I've read laments scratched into plaster. Lord, deliver us from these shadows. Let us have a shepherd, not a corpse judge. Those anonymous pleas remind me that even amid depravity, hope clung like ivy to broken walls. The era of the pornocracy ended only when Otto II's forces marched into Rome in 965, banishing the princess matriarch and her clan from the city. But the wounds ran deep. The popes who followed swore oaths of reform, promising independence from noble clutches. Their words set the stage for the next wave of change, the rise of the reforming papacy of Hildebrand, or later Gregory VII. But that, too, would come only after more bloodshed. In my mind's eye, I still see the flicker of torches in those long-ago nights. Theodora's silhouette framed by draped curtains, Marozia's triumphant stride down marble steps, and a dead pope trying vainly to defend himself at a trial no living man had called. These images haunt me, not for their gore, but for the reminder that any institution, no matter how divine its mission, can become a battlefield for human greed. So as those gilded memories fade into the dust of centuries, let them remind us the papacy's history is not a straight line of sanctity, but a tapestry woven with ambition's darkest threads. The ghosts of the pornocracy still whisper in the halls of St. Peter's, if only we would listen. When I first followed the faint trail of Gregory VII's life, I didn't expect to find a monk whose plain woolen habit and stern gaze would shake all of Christendom. Yet, in 1073, the cardinals chose Hildebrand, Cluny's reforming abbot, as pope, and from that moment, the church would never be the same. Gregory arrived in Rome not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim, carrying little more than a simple wooden crozier and a heart burdened by memories of corruption. The Lateran palace still reeked of simony and scandal. Money had bought bishoprics, powerful families controlled papal elections, and priests owed more loyalty to their feudal lords than to their flocks. Gregory viewed it all as an insult to Christ, and he vowed to reverse it. His very first bull, Dictatus Papae, read like a manifesto for spiritual revolution. He declared that only the Pope could appoint or depose bishops and abbots, that he alone could convene church councils, and that he held the power to release subjects from allegiance to erring rulers. When I first saw a fragment of this text, its boldness stunned me. Here was a man daring to claim authority over emperors. No decree better exemplifies Gregory's vision than his war against lay investiture. For centuries, kings and emperors had granted bishops their rings and staves, symbols of spiritual office, so that the newly ordained would owe fealty to the crown. Gregory viewed this as a brazen theft. Secular princes had no right to meddle in the church's innermost affairs. He demanded that the ring and staff be strictly ecclesiastical symbols conferred only by the Pope or his legates. When Emperor Henry IV, only 6 years past the age of majority, continued to appoint bishops in Germany, Gregory issued an ultimatum. Letters crackled through the Alps, carrying the Pope's thunderous words, "Desist or face excommunication." Imagine being a teenage monarch, accustomed to absolute rule, suddenly confronted by a man in a woolen robe proclaiming, "You are beneath me in the sight of God." Henry ignored the warning. In January 1076, he convened a council at Worms, where German bishops pronounced Gregory deposed. The young emperor saw it as a victory. Rome's markets rang with merchants proclaiming the Pope disgraced. But Gregory answered with equal ferocity. He pronounced Henry excommunicated, freeing all Christians in the empire from their oaths of loyalty. I often picture those letters fluttering onto palace desks, the ink still wet, sealing the fate of empires. Excommunication in the Middle Ages was more than spiritual censure. It was a political dagger. Vassals began deserting Henry, clergy refused his commands, and even relatives whispered of rebellion. Cut off from the sacraments, the emperor's crown seemed to slip. Nightmares of dethronement must have stalked his sleep. In late 1076, Henry made a desperate journey through icy passes toward Italy. He sought Gregory's mercy not in the grandeur of St. Peter's, but in the bleak courtyard of Canossa Fortress, where Matilda of Tuscany held the gates. For 3 days and 3 nights, in the driving snow, Henry stood barefoot and bareheaded, clad in sackcloth, begging forgiveness. Chroniclers tell of Gregory observing from a high window, his eyes unreadable. At last, on the 3rd dawn, the Pope crossed the drawbridge, placed his hand on the emperor's head, and lifted the sentence of excommunication. That moment An emperor humbled before a monk became legend. I once climbed the rocky path to Canossa, marveling that such gravity once hovered there. The penitential grit still seems to cling to the stones, as if Henry's remorse was etched into the very walls. Yet absolution did not end their conflict. Henry returned to Germany, rallied his supporters, and in 1080 marched on Rome. He installed an anti-pope, Clement III, who crowned him emperor at St. Peter's. Gregory retreated into exile, wandering from fortress to monastery, often under threat of siege. He wrote letters as he traveled, urging faithful Christians to remain loyal, even as he watched imperial standards raised over sacred basilicas. By 1084, Henry's forces besieged Rome itself. Starvation stalked the streets. The faithful clung to relics as food ran out. Gregory took refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo, joined by a handful of loyal knights and canons. From its ramparts he witnessed his city's fall. The Lateran sacked, the clergy dispersed, the people forced to swear fealty to Clement III. I imagine him there cloaked in ash and candle smoke, his voice hoarse from prayers, wondering if the church would survive such a blow. He did not live to see the tide fully turn. In May of 1085, weakened by age and exile, Gregory died in Salerno. His tomb bore a simple inscription: "Here lies Gregory, who would not bow to princes." Yet the story did not end with his death. His supporters in Rome soon rose up, expelled Clement III, and elected Victor III and then Urban II. Gregory's battle for a church unshackled from secular rulers became a founding myth for the papacy's independence. In the decades that followed, the Concordat of Worms officially separated imperial and ecclesiastical investiture, a compromise born of Gregory's vision. It allowed emperors a ceremonial role, but reserved spiritual symbols for the church. The investiture controversy left scars, but also forged a new equilibrium. Princely crowns and papal tiaras would henceforth occupy distinct realms. Walking among the ruins of 11th century Rome, I feel Gregory's presence in the hush of abandoned monasteries and the cracks of broken columns. His story reminds me that a single unwavering conviction of Christ's lordship over all can topple kingdoms. Yet it also warns that power's dance with idealism breeds both triumph and tragedy. The monk pope's legacy endures wherever bishops are chosen for faith and not for feudal favor, and wherever leaders tremble at the summons of conscience more than the clang of steel. When I first stood beneath the shadow of Clermont's cathedral in 1095, I could almost taste the fervor in the autumn air. Rumor had spread that Pope Urban II himself would speak from the pulpit, an unthinkable event in a city more accustomed to local bishops than papal legates. Yet there he was, mounted on a makeshift platform of oak boards, his pallium catching the morning sunlight as he surveyed the throng of clergy, knights, and peasants gathered in that damp field outside town. Urban II was no cloistered monk. Born Odo of Ligury, he'd risen through the ranks by combining genuine piety with political finesse, skills honed first at the court of Pope Nicholas II, later as a reformer in Milan, and finally as pontiff in 1088, when the investiture conflict still smoldered across Europe. Yet nothing in his early career quite prepared him for the task he would undertake at Clermont. The moment of reckoning arrived when he raised his right hand and intoned words that would echo through centuries. "Let the wicked be crushed by the hand of the Lord, and let those who love him go forth to rescue the holy places." He unfurled the banner of the cross, and gasps rippled through the crowd. Knights grasped their swords as if it were anointed for battle. Devout pilgrims wept, convinced they were beholding divine will itself. Behind that stirring oratory lay weeks of clandestine planning. Urban had received urgent pleas from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, desperate for aid against Seljuk incursions in Anatolia. But this was more than realpolitik. To the Pope, the crusade offered a chance to unite warring Christian princes under one banner, redirect the European violence away from internecine feuds, and reaffirm the papacy's moral authority. He framed it as the ultimate penitential pilgrimage. For every step taken toward Jerusalem, sins would be absolved as surely as if one had knelt before a confessor. In the days that followed, I watched as the idea blossomed like wildfire through city after city. In Tours, a young knight named Hervé swore an oath before the cathedral doors. In Lyon, merchants pledged caravans of supplies. In Normandy, even women and children prepared to journey east. Urban's promise of plenary indulgence, complete remission of sins, shone brighter in many minds than any earthly reward. Yet it wasn't all uniform devotion. I heard mutters in the monasteries, where some abbots worried that armed pilgrimage would desecrate the sacred. In Paris, university masters debated whether monks turned warriors would forsake true contemplation. And in the slums of urban markets, opportunists whispered of profiteering, selling horses at inflated prices, forging letters of safe conduct, and organizing pilgrim guides for city gates. By the spring of 1096, millions across Europe were on the move. I crossed paths with a ragged procession near Vienna, peasants carrying crude wooden crosses, singing hymns in Polish, German, and broken Latin. I spoke to a French noble, Lord Lambert, whose gleaming armor contrasted sharply with the tattered banners behind him. He told me candidly he sought not only spiritual merit, but land and title in the East, a sentiment repeated by many of his peers. As the armies converged on Constantinople, distrust simmered beneath the surface. Alexios's advisors eyed the Latin crusaders warily, recalling earlier raids on Byzantine towns by unruly Western horsemen. Yet Urban had negotiated terms. Crusader leaders swore fealty to the emperor, promising to return former imperial lands. Whether these oaths would hold when fortune's wheel turned was another matter. When the Crusaders finally marched through the Bosporus, I accompanied a contingent under Count Robert of Flanders. From my vantage on a stable cart, I saw the dome of Hagia Sophia glimmering at dawn and heard an undercurrent of awe as knights crossed themselves, declaring they would soon bathe in the Jordan and stand on Golgotha's hill. Their zeal was intoxicating and terrifying. The real test came at Antioch in 1098, when months of siege turned saints into sinners by thirst and hunger. I remember watching Count Raymond faint as he climbed a ladder, only to fall back into enemy arrows. Starving men resorted to eating mule meat, sometimes raw, crying that their suffering redeemed them. When the city finally fell, thanks to a supposed vision of St. Andrew guiding a secret gate's opening, the jubilation was fierce, and the massacre that followed was brutal enough to haunt even the hardest warrior. Through it all, Urban's voice reverberated like a distant thunder. Though he never set foot in the Holy Land himself, he issued letters urging restraint toward Christian inhabitants, dispatching legates to keep the crusade focused on Muslim-held armies, not heretical Christians. Yet, controlling a movement fueled by promises of spoils and salvation proved almost impossible. Ambushed caravans, looted villages, and disputes over shares of booty were constant scourges. By 1100, Jerusalem lay in Crusader hands. I climbed the Mount of Olives on a moonlit night alongside fatigued knights, their gaunt faces lit by hope and horror. Beneath me, the city's walls glimmered as if bathed in holy fire. The Holy Sepulchre stood battered but standing, its shattered columns bearing the marks of conflict. Seeing it, I understood why so many had marched through death and desert. Jerusalem was both compass and promise, a center of the Christian world made real. When the news reached Rome, Urban's successor, Paschal II, held a solemn mass in St. Peter's. The Pope proclaimed a day of thanksgiving, weaving the Crusaders' victories into the papacy's narrative of divine mandate. Yet even then, murmurs began. How to govern these new states, how to reconcile Crusader claims with Byzantine interests, and how to ensure future pilgrim caravans could pass in safety. Looking back, I see the First Crusade as a crucible for the medieval church, uniting Christendom, expanding papal influence, but also revealing the perils of holy war. Urban's call had tapped into the era's fiercest currents: penance, pilgrimage, and the promise of eternal reward. It reshaped political borders, birthed new kingdoms in Antioch and Edessa, and set a precedent for military piety that would echo in later crusades. Yet for every triumph, there were tragedies: massacres that stained holy ground, feuds among crusader princes, and a growing schism with Eastern churches. The papacy's claim to direct the sword in God's name left deep scars, both spiritual and political. I've spent years tracing the roots of those crusader armies across Anatolia's plains and Syria's hills, noting where churches replaced mosques and where once clear roads lay abandoned. In the end, the First Crusade stands as testament to the medieval church's capacity for both grandeur and grim excess. Urban II's voice may have summoned legions, but the complexity of sustaining that vision amid clashing cultures, competing ambitions, and human frailty revealed just how precarious the fusion of faith and force can be. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear those countless hymns carried on the desert wind, and I wonder whether the promise of redemption ever fully outweighed the cost. After the triumph at Jerusalem, the air in the holy city tasted of salt and sorrow in equal measure. I still feel it when I recall that first dawn on the Mount of Olives, how the golden dome of the Holy Sepulchre seemed to pulse like a living heart, even as the streets below bore the scars of siege and slaughter. Yet for every tear shed in triumph, there were a dozen more shed in loss. Widows wailing for husbands who never returned, children clutching empty slings once their fathers' weapons, and pilgrims who wandered hobbling through dusty lanes, half blinded by infection or exhaustion. In those first fragile years of the Latin kingdom, I rode beside Baldwin of Bologna as he carved a Christian realm out of shattered fiefdoms. He styled himself King of Jerusalem, a title that once would have seemed blasphemy, but on that battered throne it carried both promise and peril. Baldwin's small court gathered under thrumming banners stitched with crosses, French knights in chainmail, Armenian craftsmen, Genoese merchants hawking spices, and Bedouin guides who knew the deserts better than any map. I learned quickly that governing the Holy Land demanded a different mind from crusading. Baldwin held councils beneath stone colonnades where barons argued over who owed what in taxes, bishops wrangled about church lands, and merchants haggled for trading rights in Gaza and Tyre. I once overheard a heated debate over olive groves. Did they belong to the Church of the Nativity or to a merchant syndicate from Amalfi? The dispute ended only when Baldwin drew his sword and decreed that both sides must share the harvest or see their groves burned. Those shared olive presses became emblematic of the kingdom's fragile fabric. Christian lords, Muslim farmers forced into new tribute, and Jewish communities seeking arms and protection under Baldwin's charter. Their participation was neither voluntary nor entirely equal, but it formed a mosaic of coexistence that teetered on the edge of collapse with every caravan raid and every grain shortage. It was within this crucible that the first of the military monastic orders arose. I can still picture Hugh of Pons, a gaunt knight in white mantle, arriving at Baldwin's court with 8 companions. They pledged to defend pilgrims and protect the road to Jerusalem. Baldwin offered them the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount as their headquarters, an irony neither party fully appreciated at the time. They became known simply as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, later the Knights Templar. Their red cross, sewn on white mantles, glowed like a warning, a promise that these men would fight without pay, save ransom-bound captives, and die before abandoning a pilgrim. Not far down the street, the Brothers Hospitaller tended the sick and wounded in ramshackle hospitals. Their slate-roofed wards, built near the pools of Bethesda, echoed day and night with the groans of fevered men and the murmured prayers of daughters of St. Peter, women who knelt beside the dying, washing their sores with vinegar and wine. I once witnessed Sister Martha lean over a dying Turk, whispering the Lord's Prayer, as though the man's faith could be mended even in his final moments. In that courtyard of wooden benches, life and death mingled beneath date palms, and the sisterhood's compassion shone as brightly as any crusader's sword. Yet these orders' rising power stirred envy and fear. At Jerusalem's great council of Nablus in 1120, nobles and prelates met to codify laws on adultery, theft, and marital rights. But the Templars found themselves questioned. Did they answer to the king or the pope? Bernard of Clairvaux, the eloquent Cistercian abbot, was dispatched to preach their cause in Europe. I traveled with his entourage through Bourges and Tours, marveling at Bernard's rhetoric. He spoke of poverty as a crown, chastity as a fortress, and obedience as a ladder to heaven. Yet I saw moments when his eyes glistened with something like doubt, as if he wondered whether spiritual rigor could survive the shadow of the Crusaders' blade. Back in Jerusalem, politics remained a labyrinth. The Byzantine Empire watched warily as Crusader states solidified along its borders. Emperor John II Comnenus demanded oaths of fealty from each Latin ruler. Some complied, others whispered of a Western plot to seize Constantinople itself. I stood on the ramparts of Antioch, gazing east across the Orontes, and noted the throng of Greek merchants entering through Anthony's Gate, traders whose wares stained the streets with silks and ceramics, even as their priests muttered condemnations of Latins who defiled holy sites. It was this tension between East and West, church and state, knight and monk, that gave birth to the Second Crusade. In 1144, the county of Edessa fell to Zengi, and the news struck Europe like a thunderclap. I was in Champagne when Bishop Hugh of Orleans rode into Troyes on a black stallion, his face a mask of terror. "Edessa is lost," he proclaimed before the market square. "Christendom bleeds again." The people's shrieks echoed through the narrow lanes, and at night the churches glowed with candlelight as nobles plotted to reclaim the fallen county. Pope Eugene III answered with a bull, quantum predecessories. Invoking the First Crusade's promise of indulgence, he called for a fresh march to the east. Bernard of Clairvaux, aged and unbowed, once more took up the banner, preaching in every great cathedral and raising armies that swelled under both zeal and feudal obligation. I accompanied a detachment of German knights who marched under King Conrad III, men whose armor gleamed nearly as bright as their faith. Yet the land they entered was changed. Turks had honed their tactics near Damascus, marshals had fortified Aleppo, and the desert itself dared crusaders to cross its sands. The road to Edessa became a gauntlet, scorching days, freezing nights, and hostile skirmishes at every oasis. I still recall the dust-choked howls when Conrad's knights charged near Dorylaeum, only to be cut to pieces beneath archers' rain of arrows. Their banners fell, their horses lay in the sand, and only a handful staggered back to Antioch, their swords dulled by stones. Meanwhile, in France, King Louis VII launched his own crusade by sea. I sailed with an English contingent on creaking galleys, bound for Acre. During the voyage, the men prayed ceaselessly, chanting psalms as the salt spray lashed their faces. But when they landed, they found disease as lethal as enemy swords. Dysentery ran like wildfire through camp. Bodies were sunk at sea to guard against plague, and the survivors trudged inland gaunt and terror-stricken. By the time Crusader armies converged on Damascus in 1148, hope was a fragile ember. The initial assault shattered on the city's walls. Supplies ran low, dissent rippled through the camp, and whispers rose that Damascus's rulers might yet pay tribute rather than face siege. At dawn, on the third day, the armies broke, retreating in confusion. I watched as dust swallowed their retreating banners, and murmurings grew into laments. We have failed the Lord. The Second Crusade collapsed more spectacularly than it had risen. European nobles returned humiliated, the papacy's moral authority dimmed, and Muslim leaders, notably Nur ad-Din, seized the moment to unite Syrian emirates against a weakened foe. The loss of Damascus marked the end of Crusader expansion, a turning point when the Kingdom of Jerusalem became a fragile archipelago of fortresses and coastal enclaves rather than a true polity. In the wake of this failure, I traveled to Jerusalem to witness the dismantling of once proud siege engines and the hasty reforging of alliances with the Byzantines. Baldwin III extended his hand to Emperor Emmanuel I, sharing control of coastal towns in exchange for military support. The Templars and Hospitallers, chastened but unbroken, fortified their castles, Carac, Crac de Chevalier, turning them into impregnable bulwarks against invasion. The echoes of the Second Crusade lingered through Europe and the Levant alike, in shattered dreams of holy conquest, in the mending of church-state relations, and in the rise of new military orders like the Teutonic Knights. It was a lesson seared into every monk's ledger and knight's memory. Holy war demanded both divine favor and earthly wisdom, and lacked one as much as the other, doomed believers to defeat. See, yet even amid defeat, the hope of redemption burned on. Pilgrim routes remained open. Relics still drew supplicants to Jerusalem, and the church began to weave a new strategy: diplomacy, trade treaties, and fortification, rather than always raising the cross in blood. As I rode home through the silent hills of Asia Minor, I sensed a shift. The crusading spirit would endure, but it would bend and change, shaped by the very sands and stones that once bore witness to both blessings and bloodshed. When the dust settled on the plains at Hattin, the true scale of Saladin's triumph only began to emerge. Over the next days, I traveled alongside his envoys as they made their rounds, not merely to broker terms but to witness firsthand how a single battle could redraw the boundaries of faith and power. I remember crossing the scorched ridge where knights had fallen in their heavy armor. Their mail clinked faintly underfoot as though whispering the last echoes of their chivalric vows. Nearby, I found a discarded banner of Auvergne, a simple blue field with a golden cross, torn nearly to shreds by stones and steel. Touching its frayed edge, I felt the weight of broken faith. Once a proud standard, now hollowed by defeat. Saladin, for all his martial prowess, insisted on mercy. In the camp beyond Hatton's dusty graveyard, I joined him one morning as he oversaw the ransoming of prisoners. Over 50 noble captives, pillaged from the Christian host, sat bound yet unbroken before him. He granted them generous terms, a moderate ransom, safe conduct to Tyre or Acre, and a promise that no captive would be executed, tortured, or sold into servitude. I saw tears in the eyes of squires reunited with their fathers, and heard raw gratitude from barons who feared a darker fate. Saladin's clemency burned brighter than any trophy taken from the field. When return caravans set out, I rode among them to document the fragile threads that still bound the Crusader states. Knights bore their ransoms as well as anxious prayers, for how would their lords withstand Saladin's next move? As we passed through Tiberias, its empty citadel loomed over ruined vineyards, a silent witness to the swiftness of conquest. Olive presses lay overturned, their wooden beams splintered, hardware once used to press oil now twisted into tokens of war. News of Hatton reached Jerusalem in discreet messages carried by Bedouin riders. I entered the city under cover of darkness and found its mood as fractured as its battered walls. In St. Anne's crypt, a handful of knights knelt before a flickering lamp, reciting the Psalms of penitence. Outside, merchants locked their shops, fearful that Saladin's banners would soon fly above the Tower of David. Within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the canons distributed alms to starving families, efforts hampered by rumors that the Sultan's army would soon blockade Jerusalem itself. Saladin's siege began in earnest on September 20th, 1187. I sought vantage on the Mount of Olives, where I watched trebuchets flung stones like thunderbolts against the city's northern walls. Each impact sent tremors through the mud-brick ramparts and clouds of dust that blotted out the dawn. Arrows darkened the sky as Saladin's archers took positions on nearby high ground, raining death on defenders scrambling atop the battlements. Inside the city, panic jostled with hope. I slipped into the Hospitaller quarter and witnessed the brothers operating at fever pitch. Crude splints, fashioned from wood, wine, and myrrh, poured onto wounds, and whispered prayers offered to the wounded whose cries echoed through the narrow corridors. I saw a young page, no more than 15, clutching a makeshift bandage to a gash in his thigh, eyes locked on a worn painting of St. John the Baptist, whose severed head rested on a platter. I thought then how closely sacrifice and salvation entwined in these stones. On the 9th day of siege, Saladin offered terms: surrender in exchange for safe passage. The Christian leaders, weary and frayed, conferred beneath a battered dais in the Temple Mount's grand hall. I stood just outside as King Guy, his chainmail tattered and helmet dented, stepped forward to negotiate. His voice trembled, not from fear of death, but from the dread of betraying Jerusalem's sacred trust. Saladin, unarmored except for a simple steel cap, approached and laid a reassuring hand on the king's shoulder, speaking words that carried on the breeze in Arabic and Latin. Your people shall go free, your relics remain yours, and this city, though mine, shall be a sanctuary for all who come in peace. When the white banner rose above Jaffa Gate on October 2nd, I joined the throng of Muslims and Christians alike who gathered to witness the handover. Saladin entered the city in humble procession, no triumphal carriages or spoils displayed, just his horse, his retinue, and the clear intention that faith, not fear, would mark his rule. He paused at the Golden Gate, laying his palm against the ancient bronze doors that legend said no Christian had touched since the temple's destruction. I felt his fingers tremble for a heartbeat, as though he sensed the centuries pressing upon him. In the aftermath, I stayed in Jerusalem for weeks, chronicling how Saladin sought to restore life amid ruin. He ordered the repair of aqueducts broken during the siege, reopened markets shuttered for months, and invited Muslim, Christian, and Jewish merchants to trade in peace. In the bazaars, I watched Armenian dyers lifting rich indigo fabrics, Jewish silversmiths honing delicate filigree, and Christian spice traders unpacking cinnamon and nutmeg from caravans that had braved the sea. The city's pulse, once flatlined by war, began to flutter again. Perhaps the most poignant sight came at dawn one morning when I toured the Holy Sepulchre with a small group of Latin clergy granted access by Saladin himself. We entered through a side door, passing Muslim guards who saluted rather than scorned. Inside, friars knelt on cold stone, brushing dust from the aedicule where Christ's tomb lay. They whispered fragments of ancient liturgies, their voices a fragile thread across the marble floor. When they placed candles before the shrine, Saladin's imam lit them in turn. An unspoken covenant that holy ground transcended conquest. As I departed Jerusalem in late autumn, I carried with me a message for Europe. The fall of the Holy City was not merely a military defeat, but a profound moral challenge. Saladin had shown that might could bend to mercy, that the victor could be magnanimous, and that faith, whether Islamic or Christian, could inspire not just zeal, but grace. In letters I later sent to abbeys and courts, I urged reflection. If the Christian West called itself the defender of the faith, could it match Saladin's example when new crusades loomed on the horizon? Yet I knew the answer. As I retraced my steps back through Damascus and Aleppo, I heard the grinding of siege engines being transported westward, swords sharpened for fresh holy wars, and preachers drumming up fervor for a new adventure. The tapestry had shifted, but the pattern of zeal and conflict remained woven into the fabric of Christendom. Saladin's mercy would be praised in song, yet forgotten in strategy. I realized then that true victory over division, cruelty, and doubt would require more than a single campaign. Standing beneath the Syrian night sky, studded with stars like uncounted prayers, I whispered my own plea, that history's most storied sultan would not be remembered only for what he conquered, but for what he forgave. Only then, I thought, might the church learn that power tempered by mercy could outshine any crown or cross. When word of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe in 1188, the continent convulsed with grief and outrage. I was in a windswept abbey courtyard in Normandy when the messenger arrived, an emaciated pilgrim clutching a tattered letter sealed with salt-stained wax. His eyes burned with sorrow as he spoke of the city's surrender and of Christian captives bound for Damascus. That night, the monastery's chapel glowed with torchlight as monks and knights vowed vengeance in equal measure. Thus was born the Third Crusade. Behind the vows lay a tangle of politics. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick the Barbarossa answered first, rallying German princes under his iron banner. He preached at Worms and Speyer, declaring that no Christian would rest until the gates of Jerusalem rang with Christian prayer once more. His was a crusade of thunder and steel, and I rode with his vanguard through the Black Forest, marveling at the discipline of his seasoned knights. Yet, even as they camped along the Danube, Frederick's restless ambition surfaced. He insisted on imperial rights in the East, a claim that sowed quiet dissent among bishops who feared a repeat of past investiture conflicts. Meanwhile, in France, King Philip II Augustus heard the call in 1189. The news of Saladin's clemency at Jerusalem had kindled fierce pride in his court. Pride quickly curdled into indignation at the loss. Philip's levee en masse swept through Paris like a flame, drawing nobles who dreamed of glory and clergy who craved penitential garments. At Acre, I saw him stride beneath the city's battered walls, his clasped hands lifted in prayer even as his eyes plotted siege works. He brought engineers to rebuild the crumbling towers and archers to storm its gates. Had it not been for Frederick's premature crossing into Anatolia, Philip might never have reached the Levant at all. It was Richard I of England, the Lionheart, who finally united the Crusader host. He set sail from Dover in 1190, leaving a kingdom riven by court intrigue and aging regents. At Messina, he welcomed Philip's compliments with a courteous nod, concealing a simmering rivalry. Some nights, I watched them converse by candlelight. Two monarchs whose mutual respect barely concealed the bitterness of competition. Together they fortified Cyprus and sailed for Acre, but Richard's true measure would be seen on the battlefield. Acre's fall in 1191 marked the Crusade's first great triumph. The city sank into silence after a year-long siege, its Saracen garrison either slain or sold for ransom. I passed through its gates as a freed prisoner, marveling at its wounded walls and shattered markets. Frederick's northern knights arrived soon after, their banners muddy from Anatolia's rivers, but the emperor himself had drowned crossing the Salif that spring. His body recovered only days later. The tragedy fractured the German contingent. Some returned home, while others swore loyalty to Richard and Philip. The death of Frederick underscored a harsh lesson. The East would not bend easily to European will. Emboldened by Acre, Richard and Philip marched south toward Jaffa. Their armies, Crusader knights, disinherited younger sons, and enthusiastic townsmen advanced through scorching plains, where each oasis was a bargain in blood. At Arsuf, on September 7, 1191, Saladin's forces unleashed a fierce ambush. I stood on a ridge as crossbow quarrels flashed like starlight against dusk's red sky. For hours the Christians held tight, their disciplined lines pressured by arquebusiers and horse archers. Then Richard, steel-eyed and resolute, led the charge. Trumpets blared, horses thundered, and the Muslim lines gave way. Arsuf became legend as the Battle of Iron Resolve, and I still feel the ground tremble under their hoofbeats. Following that victory, the Crusaders reached Jaffa and rebuilt its defenses. Philip, ever wary, argued they should press on toward Jerusalem at once. Richard cautioned patience, knowing that a direct march without supply lines would founder. Their quarrels echoed through dusty tents. At one point, Philip raised his banner and returned to France, leaving Richard to negotiate with a foe who refused to yield the Holy City. In that moment, the Crusade's purpose fractured. Ambition and strategy veered apart. Richard marched alone to negotiate with Saladin at Ramla. There, under a tawny sky, they met as two warriors rather than as king and sultan. I watched from a hidden crevice as they spoke through interpreters, Richard in his chainmail hauberk, Saladin in simple robes. Their exchange, described later in troubadour songs, balanced honor and enmity. Saladin offered to surrender Jerusalem if the Crusaders left Islam's sacred places intact. Richard, bound by oaths to recapture the city outright, refused. They parted with mutual respect, each aware that their conflict was as personal as it was political. By early 1192, the campaign stalled. Supply ships scarce, barons weary, and disease thinning the ranks, Richard made a desperate lightning raid on Jerusalem itself, marching under cover of night to within sight of the city's golden domes. When dawn rose, he knelt on a ridge overlooking the holy sites, tears in his eyes, so says one eyewitness, but turned back rather than assault its walls. He realized that even he could not marshal victory without risking total disaster. The crusade concluded with the Treaty of Jaffa in September 1192. Christians would retain coastal cities, Acre, Jaffa, and Ascalon, ensuring pilgrim access, while Jerusalem remained under Saladin's control. I accompanied Richard to Tyre, where he signed the pact on chipped marble before banners of both faiths fluttered side by side. To many it felt like defeat, to others a pragmatic peace. Richard departed soon after, ill and grief-worn, yet his name endured as the Lionheart who had dared the impossible. As I made my way back through Cyprus and into the Mediterranean lanes, I reflected on the Third Crusade's legacy. It had united Europe's greatest monarchs, forged legends of valor, and yet failed its central goal. I wrote letters warning that crusading zeal, unmoored from diplomatic cunning, risked repeating history's sorrowful cycles. The treaty held for decades, allowing pilgrim caravans to pass and commerce to revive along the Levantine coast. But Jerusalem's walls, silent once more to Christian hymn, stood as a reminder that faith alone could not batter a stone. In the centuries since, troubadours and chroniclers have dramatized Richard's bravery and Saladin's chivalry, but I remember most the moments in between, the sleepless nights in siege camps, the whispered prayers in desert oases, and the faces of knights who fell in the dust. The Third Crusade was as much a testament to human will as it was to heartfelt piety, a crucible where ambition, honor, and faith were tested against desert winds and the unyielding stone of holy cities. And as I drift along the coast to the south, I carry with me the lingering question: if valor alone could not reclaim Jerusalem, what hope had the faithful of any age against the stubborn march of history? And so, our journey through Crusader triumph and tragedy draws to a close. From shattered banners on the plains of Hattin to the hard-won calm of the Treaty of Jaffa, we've seen how faith and ambition can light the world aflame, and how mercy and pragmatism sometimes hold it together. And if this tale of swords, sanctuaries, and shattered dreams stirred your curiosity, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden corners, and ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe now.